Hello, and welcome back to Stories from History, where we go over interesting stories, characters, people from history, just kind of discuss interesting topics really from history. If it's a story from history that's interesting, we're willing to tell it. And today we have a very interesting story to talk about. We're going to talk about the assassination of Julius Caesar. Now, I'm sure Julius Caesar is a name that many of you as history lovers are acquainted with. So I don't think I need to go into too much detail about Julius Caesar and his life. But I will probably have a video up later about the life of Julius Caesar. But what we can tell you to get into the video is that the assassination of Julius Caesar was one of the most important events in Roman history, because his assassination was what created the empire and killed the republic. And it went from a rule of a few top, the oligarchs and the people having some power, to completely centralized in one man, the emperor, who in many respects, I guess Julius Caesar he wasn't the first emperor, but he laid down the stones for who would be the first emperor, his adopted son, Octavian, or better known as Augustus. And today we'll talk about how that assassination took place. So we'll get into it right now. But before the assassination happened, for 8 long years, Julius Caesar had been serving the Roman Republic in war. From about 58 to 50 BC, he fought his way across Gaul, which is modern-day France, and a bit more, defeating numerous tribes, crossing rivers that many thought were impassable, like the Rhine, and expanding Rome's territory further than any general before him. So by the time that he returned, he wasn't just a politician, he had reached legend status, and he was followed by a hardened group of legions who owed their loyalty to him personally. And it was that loyalty of this legions that really terrified the Senate. So his enemies within the Senate demanded that he disbanded his army and he returned to Rome as a private citizen, because there were some rules that he'd broken when he was away and they wanted to try and arrest him for it. And they knew that without his legions, Caesar would be in a vulnerable position. They'd be able to prosecute him or humiliate him or just destroy him politically in whatever way they had. And so, as many of you know, Caesar refused to do this. And in 49 BC, he crossed the small river Rubicon with his army. And this was an act that was illegal under Roman law and unmistakable in its meaning. It meant that he was going to war with Rome. And civil war followed, and Rome tore itself apart. And out of that destruction came the victorious Julius Caesar. By 45 BC, Caesar, he defeated the last of the resistance to his rise to power. And his rivals were either dead, exiled, or, important to know, pardoned. See, Julius Caesar liked to pardon his enemies as a show of, they called it clementia, but it was like clemency, forgiveness. And it was something that Caesar kind of prided himself on, like he was willing to accept even some of his most ruthless enemies. But this would be a mistake, as we will later see. But by this time, Rome was exhausted and stability mattered more than ideals. And so the Senate did what it always did in moments of crisis. It gave one man, extraordinary powers, and this was Julius Caesar. He was appointed dictator, then dictator for 10 years, and then finally in early 44 BC, dictator perpetual, which means dictator for life. So to Caesar it seemed practical. Rome is at risk of this and that. I'm going to restore order and be the dictator. But to many Romans, this felt like the end of the republic that they loved, or that they'd worked so hard to preserve. Rome had overthrown its kings nearly 500 years earlier. So the very idea of monarchy was toxic. And Caesar was aware of this. He never used the title Rex, which means king. But it was his actions that began to suggest that he no longer needed to use that title. He basically was the king. And ancient historians identify 3 incidents between 45 and 44 BC that finally convinced many Romans that Caesar was trying to basically be a king. So the first incident occurred in March 44 BC, or possibly in early 45 BC. The Senate voted Caesar an enormous list of new honors, and they marched as a delegation to the Temple of Venus Genetrix to present them to him formally. And under Roman etiquette, Caesar was expected to rise to greet these senators that had come to march to him as a delegation, and he did not. Instead, he stayed seated and he joked that his honor should be reduced, not increased. Now, whether Caesar was sick, or others were holding him down, or he didn't want to stand up, the effect of this was bad. By refusing to do this, he basically appeared to reject not only the honors, but the actual authority of the Senate itself. It was from that moment that many senators believed, like, okay, Caesar doesn't think that the Republic still matters, and he doesn't think that the Senate still matters. So that was the first incident. Then the second incident was 2 tribunes of the people discovered the diadem, which is a royal headband, and it was placed onto a statue of Caesar in the Roman Forum. And they were ordered to remove it immediately, but the symbol was unmistakable, as this was what kings wore. So Caesar suspected that maybe the tribunes had staged this incident themselves to make themselves look like, Republican heroics that, were trying to preserve the sanctity of the Republic. But then things escalated. As Caesar rode into Rome along the Appian Way, members of the crowd began calling him Rex, king. And Caesar replied with a sharp piece of wordplay, "I am not Rex, but Caesar." And to the crowd, this sounded like a good little line, but to the tribunes, this sounded dangerous. And they actually ordered a man arrested for shouting Rex, and Caesar turned against him. In a meeting of the Senate, he accused the tribunes of stirring opposition and had them stripped of office and expelled from the Senate. And this was a big mistake, because the tribunes represented the common people. So by punishing them, Caesar appeared to place himself above popular law, and public opinion began to shift again. So that was the second incident. Now this is the third one. So, during the festival of Lupercalia, I think it was like a theatre performance or in the Colosseum, something where there was a large crowd watching stuff. Caesar was in the audience. And before this massive crowd, Caesar was sat on a rostra, one of those like high up chairs for, the upper class, cool guys, whatever. And his co-consul and ally Mark Antony climbed up to him and placed a diadem on his head, like a crown. And Antony declared that the people offered it to him, and Caesar removed it. And there was a few claps and mostly silence. Antony placed it on him again. More silence. Finally, Caesar removed the diadem for good and declared, "Jupiter alone of the Romans is king." And this time, the people cheered. But for the senators, this suspicion turned into certainty, because they believed that Caesar was trying to test the crowd and trying to gauge whether Rome was ready for a king or not. And they took this not well. you know, very soon, the conspiracies had already began to form, and they were prepared to assassinate Julius Caesar. So, we set the stage. It's 44 BC, February, and there's a meeting going on between two guys, Gaius Cassius Longius and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius hated Caesar, and Brutus was torn. You see, Caesar had pardoned Brutus and trusted him and promoted him. But Brutus believed that no man, however brilliant, should rule Rome alone. And Brutus himself, Brutus was descended from the original Brutus, who was part of the group that assassinated the last king of Rome, or toppled him. So, this was his ancestor that had kind of brought about the Republic. So Brutus felt a deep, deep connection to the Republic. At the same time, Caesar and Brutus also had their own relationship. Caesar and Brutus's mom actually had like a relationship together in that way. And some people suspected that Brutus might have actually been a son of Caesar, but regardless, Caesar had treated him well in his life because of the love he had for Brutus's mom. So they both agreed that something had to be done about Caesar attempting to basically become a king. And carefully, they began to recruit others, senators near their own age, who were experienced but not reckless. And they avoided the young, the old, the unstable. And each man was tested with vague questions before being trusted. So by about early March, around 60 men had joined the plot. And many of them were former allies of Caesar. Some driven by principle, others driven by jealousy and resentment. And they debated whether to include Mark Antony. When it became clear he would never join, some argued he should be killed too. But Brutus opposed this, which, as we'll see soon, was another mistake made by the conspirators. Killing Caesar, he insisted, would look like justice. But killing others would look like a purge, and Brutus won this argument. So when it came to choosing the moment, the conspirators considered many plans. They considered an ambush on the street, or an attack during elections, or even just straight throwing Caesar into the river. But they rejected all of them. In public, Caesar was protected by his large group of friends and supporters. But only senators were allowed inside the Senate chamber. And that is where he would be vulnerable. So, Caesar was due to leave Rome on the 18th of March for a campaign against Parthia. The last Senate meeting before his departure was scheduled for the 15th of March, the Ides, and so this date was chosen. However, Caesar wasn't completely blind to the danger of this assassination. A prophet, a seer named Spurinna, warned him that his life would be in danger no later than the Ides of March. His own wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his body bleeding and of their house collapsing, and of Caesar dead in her arms, and she begged him not to go. And at the dawn of the Ides, Caesar agreed to stay home and sent Antony to dismiss the Senate. And the conspiracy nearly collapsed at that moment. But Decimus Brutus, one of the plotters and a man Caesar trusted deeply, arrived at his house. He mocked the omens, dismissed Calpurnian's fears, and convinced Caesar that staying away would make him look weak. and this was enough to change Caesar's mind. On the way to the Senate house, Caesar passed the seer Spurinna, and he joked to him. He said, "The Ides of March have come." But Spurinna replied quietly, "Yes, but they have not yet gone." So, that day, the Senate met in the theatre of Pompey. A bit of ironic symbolism there. As Caesar took his seat, Lucius Tullius Cimber approached him with a petition, asking to have his brother pardoned for something. And Caesar waved him away. Cimber grabbed at his toga. And Caesar was shocked, and he said, "This is violence." Then Casca struck with a knife, a glancing blow to the neck of Caesar. Caesar turned and began to shout in shock, and he tried to fight back. He did, but knives just came at him from every direction. He was slashed, stabbed, and blinded by blood. And there's a lot of different accounts of his final words. Some say when he saw Brutus, he covered his face with his toga and stopped fighting back. Some say he said "Et tu, Brute," well, Shakespeare does. But what was known is that he fell at the base of Pompey's statue. He had in total 23 stab wounds. Only one was fatal, allegedly. And so they had assassinated Julius Caesar, the man they believed was trying to make himself king, and in all fairness was, kind of positioned, well, he was the dictator in perpetuity, so was a king in all but name, essentially. And so when the conspirators revealed that they had assassinated Caesar to the Roman public, the reaction was not good. They raised their bloody daggers and proclaimed freedom. But the city did not celebrate this. Doors stayed shut, the streets emptied, the people locked themselves up, and no crowds gathered to praise the liberators. Rome was not happy about this. They were afraid, because they knew that this probably meant war. And so in the days that followed, Mark Antony moved very carefully. He didn't immediately call for revenge. Instead, he strategically positioned himself as kind of a guardian of stability, so to speak. And about 2 days after the assassination, Antony convened the Senate and proposed a compromise. The assassins would not be punished, and all of Caesar's laws and reforms and everything would remain valid. And it was a masterstroke. The conspirators accepted this, believing that they had secured peace. But what they did not realize was that Antony had just neutralized their entire cause. Caesar's political legacy remained intact, but Caesar himself was gone. And now Antony controlled the narrative. So, we flash forward to Caesar's funeral, which was held in a Roman forum. And his body was laid out in public, so everyone could see the wounds. 23 stab wounds were torn into the man who had conquered Gaul and ruled Rome. Antony rose to the podium to speak. He did not denounce the assassins outright. He didn't shout. He did not accuse. Instead, he praised Caesar. He reminded the crowd of Caesar's victories, of his generosity, his mercy, and his refusal of kingship. He read aloud the honors of the Senate that they'd granted to him. and then asked quietly why such a man had died like an enemy of the state. And then Antony revealed something that no one had expected. Antony announced that Caesar's will had been opened, and that every Roman citizen Caesar had decreed would receive 300 sesterces, and that Caesar's private gardens across the river Tiber were to be given to the public, not to the elite, but for the people of Rome to enjoy. The crowd roared with applause, because this wasn't the act of a tyrant, this was an act of a man who understood power and loyalty. And as the crowd grew angrier, Antony unveiled a wax image of Caesar's body, rotating it so people could see each wound and hear where it had been struck. The mood changed. Grief turned to rage, and the crowd surged towards the Senate House, burning buildings associated with the conspirators. The men who had claimed to free Rome fled the city, not as heroes, but as hunted traitors. And the Republic had not been restored, it had collapsed completely. However, there was one more very explosive revelation to be made. Caesar had named a sole heir. It wasn't Antony, it wasn't Brutus. It wasn't one of his political allies or generals, whatever. It was an 18-year-old boy, his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius. Like up around that time, Octavian had been in Illyria, far from Rome. He was a young boy, sickly, politically unknown, but intelligent, and you could see he had a fire behind his eyes. But a nobody. Well, not nobody, but not known politically. But with this single document, Caesar's will, he became something else entirely. He took on Caesar's name and became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. And suddenly he was the most dangerous man in Rome. He arrived in Italy quietly. He was not impressive physically. He did not command legions yet. But he possessed something more powerful: Caesar's name, Caesar's fortune, and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. Antony underestimated him. He saw Octavian as a child who could be controlled, a tool to legitimize his own authority, and Octavian played along. He spoke respectfully, honored Antony publicly, and behind the scenes he began gathering support. Because Rome was about to learn a brutal lesson, that the assassination of Caesar had not ended tyranny, it had created a vacuum. The conspirators made a mistake. They believed that killing one man would restore an old system, but they were wrong. Caesar's death did not revive the Republic. It revealed that the Republic no longer existed. Power now belonged to whoever could claim Caesar's legacy and defend it. Antony would try, and Octavian would succeed. And within a single generation, Rome would no longer pretend to be free. It would have an emperor. And Julius Caesar, he went on to become a god. He may have died beneath Pompey's statue, but his name did not die with him. It became a title used for over 2,000 years later by various monarchs, starting from Rome all the way to Russia. The world would never be the same again. So, if you like that video, if you like that story from history, please do comment, Like, share, subscribe. We're currently a small channel, so all that will help. If you have any suggestions or want any other kind of videos, please do drop a comment. Like, subscribe. Keep studying, keep reading, keep being passionate about history. Stories from History, signing out.